Hello, and welcome to this third instalment in improving the quality of our language. In this session we're looking at conjunctions, which is linking pieces of information together. If you haven't watched the videos so far on what is a clause and advanced clauses, I suggest you go back and check those out, because we're going to be using some of that language in this video. Let's make a start. As a quick review, so far we've looked at a clause. A clause is what we call a unit of meaning within a sentence, and that means something that makes sense. So far, we understand that we can have central actions in a sentence, which is what really constitutes a clause. So if there are two actions in a sentence, it's likely that there's going to be two clauses. If there are two or more clauses in a single sentence, we call this a complex sentence, and this is what we want to encourage in written language. An example of a complex sentence is a sentence that has these two clauses. I like pasta, which is one clause, and I like pizza, which is another clause. And in our previous video, we talked about how the word and is what we call a conjunction. It links together clauses. It links together pieces of information. The more clauses we have in each sentence, the higher the density of our writing and the more written it becomes. So when we're writing, we really want to be including as much information in each sentence as we can before we run out of breath. Let's have a look at this idea of conjunctions, words that link clauses together. There are two different types of conjunctions that we commonly see in language. We call these types of conjunctions linking conjunctions and binding conjunctions. And there are differences between each type, which we're going to explain in today's video. Looking at our previous sentence, I like pasta and I like pizza, we can see that we have two clauses that are linked together by one conjunction, which in this case is the word and. We would call this type of conjunction a linking conjunction, because it links together two independent pieces of information. Let's explain this a little bit further. An independent clause is a type of clause that makes sense on its own. It doesn't require any additional information. When we have an independent clause plus another independent clause, we use a linking conjunction. In the sentence before, one of the pieces of information that we were looking to link together was the piece of information, I like pasta. Now, if I look at this piece on its own, it makes very clear sense. And were I to highlight half of the sentence and delete it as I've done, there would still be meaning in what this clause makes sense on its own without needing any additional extra detail. It's similar with the second piece of information in our sentence, I like pizza. In this case, if I was to get rid of the first half of the sentence, I still have a unit of meaning which isn't compromised by the other piece of information in my sentence. This makes sense, just like the other piece, and it doesn't require any extra detail. So we can see that an independent clause is a piece of information that makes sense on its own and doesn't require any further explanation. When we look at this sentence, we can see our two independent clauses linked together by the use of a conjunction. One of the ways to really tell whether it's a linking or binding conjunction is to see if you can actually swap the clauses around. If I do that, I get a sentence like this. I like pizza and I like pasta. In this case, even though the key pieces of information have gone in a different order, the meaning hasn't changed, and the reason is because one piece of information does not rely on the other to provide it with meaning. Let's consider a different type of sentence. I wore my coat because it was cold. In this case, we can see two separate clauses. I wore my coat, it was cold. And once again, we're using a word to link them together. In this case, the word because is playing the role of the conjunction. But is this a linking conjunction or a binding conjunction? In this case, we're talking about a binding conjunction. And let me explain a little bit why. A binding conjunction links together an independent clause with a dependent clause. That means a piece of information that is related to the original action. When we look at this sentence, I wore my coat because it was cold, we can see that there's a relationship between the information and the two clauses that have been shown. The wearing of the coat, which is the primary action, is happening because it was cold, and if it wasn't cold, then the action of wearing the coat wouldn't be necessary. In this case, we've shown a really clear relationship between the two. If you looked at the previous video when we were talking about the structures of a clause, you might also notice that the second part of this sentence, because it was cold, actually fulfills a significant part in the clause. It's the circumstance. In our previous videos, we talked about the fact that anything to do with why, how, where, or when, in terms of the central action, is regarded as a circumstance. And if we had looked at this particular sentence in a previous video, we would have said that it was composed of a participant, an action, a participant, and a circumstance. However, the circumstance contains a clause, even though it answers the question of why the action was performed. This is what we call a dependent clause. It's a piece of information directly related to the central action. We call this a binding conjunction because it binds the two pieces together. However, there is a really significant way that we can see whether or not this is a different type of conjunction, and that's by rearranging the sentence. Look at this variation of the same sentence. Because it was cold, comma, I wore my coat. In this case, I'm using the exact same information from the previous arrangement. However, I've been able to reorder the sentence, but still maintain the meaning. You might have noticed that in the place where because was sitting before the middle of the sentence, I've been able to put in a comma. Binding conjunctions allow us to mix up the structure of our sentences to convey information in more interesting ways. Look at this sentence and tell me whether you think it's a linking or binding conjunction. You can see the two clauses, I saw a funny picture and I was eating my breakfast. And the word in between is the word as. But is it linking or binding? A good way to test is whether or not we can move that word to the front. In this case, it is a binding conjunction because if I experiment with the structure, I can come up with a meaning that looks like this. As I was eating my breakfast, I saw a funny picture. In this case, the sentence still makes sense and the conjunction can easily sit at the front of the sentence. Therefore, it must be binding. Let's look at another sentence. I want to get ahead, so I'm completing my homework early. We're in a similar situation where we can see two clauses, I want to get ahead and I'm completing my homework early. The word so is the conjunction, but is it linking or binding? Once again, the thing to think about is whether we could move that word so to the beginning of the sentence. In this case, we're talking about a linking conjunction, because if we try to rearrange the sentence, it looks like this. So I'm completing my homework early, I want to get ahead. This does not make sense. Therefore, we can't move the conjunction, and a conjunction that cannot be moved is a linking conjunction. It can be difficult sometimes to determine the difference between a linking and binding conjunction, but with practice and experience, you'll gain a much stronger idea as to how to tell the difference between these types of information. Linking and binding conjunctions are very common elements of language, and while we prefer to use binding conjunctions when we're looking to create stronger relationships in our text, both allow us to create complex sentences. Hopefully you're able to learn from this video and to start applying some of these skills today.